Sending somebody, space exploration is kind of a costly endeavor. It's a lot of investment in there. But the kind of the logic of the argument, and this is what the Emiratis, the Saudis, and so forth have made, is that this will inspire a knowledge-based economy. This will, in a sense, inspire youth to go into these STEM fields, which we have to have for the future.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter.
It's been a week of launches. Every major spacefaring nation launched at least one rocket, with the United States launching 4 and China 3. The big U.S. news? United Launch Alliance's first Vulcan launch of the year. ULA's goal is 10 launches by year's end. And this matters because Vulcan is a heavy lift rocket with the Space Force as a prime customer. Thursday's Florida launch was Vulcan's 4th overall, and the second time a booster had problems. The company is investigating. Also Thursday, Ariane 6-4 took off from French Guiana, carrying 32 Amazon Kuiper satellites. The Ariane 6-4 is the largest rocket Europe has ever built, and this was the maiden flight. The European Space Agency and partners spent $4.3 billion developing this heavy lift system. From China, yes, the reusable experimental spacecraft launch on the Long March 2F, it is interesting, but pay attention to the Long March 10 suborbital test. That rocket is designed to send taikonauts to the moon, and it's being developed for reuse. Tuesday's test proved the crew capsule's abort system works, and the first stage can land vertically, SpaceX style. The Long March 10's first orbital demonstration may happen next year. China's plan is to send taikonauts to the moon by 2030. Also this week, on Wednesday, President Trump met with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And that got me thinking, this podcast hasn't explored Middle Eastern space efforts. 2 nations are spacefaring. 6 more are building infrastructure and writing regulations, supporting startups, and using sovereign wealth funds to invest. For an overview, we have Larry Rubin from Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. Here's our conversation. Hello, Larry. Welcome to the Downlink podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is really, I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Oh, me too. Me too. I mean, we met, I think, what was it, in 2024? It was summer. It was at IISS, and you were there talking space. But, it would be really great if you could take a moment and introduce yourself to the audience and tell us about the work that you're doing at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. Larry?
Yes, thanks so much. It's a pleasure, again, to be here. I'm an associate professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and I also co-direct our program in Washington, D.C., which students spend a semester up here, so it leaves me a lot of time in Washington, D.C. And when it comes to my work, research in particular, my background is in comparative and international relations of the Middle East. I focused a lot on religion and politics, also international security issues. And probably in the last 6-7 years or so, I focused much more on emerging technologies, in particular space. And it's kind of, I think it's an interesting story of how I've kind of moved or converged in that direction. In particular, as we know, the Middle East, for better or for worse, is quite fraught with a lot of these identity politics. They're fascinating. That's what kind of got me into it. But it's also nice to take a certain break. Space does this for a lot of reasons, as many of your listeners know, in the sense that it's this kind of everything ground. Everything happens up there without us realizing it. All those international security issues that I'd worked on in the past, if it has to do with nuclear proliferation, emerging technologies, and so forth, even and among religion and politics, believe it or not, there are various aspects.
With communications of it, right? I mean, the communications of those messages, the different companies. I mean, we had Thuraya, which is now, Yasat. I mean, space is kind of makes the place work, right?
Exactly. I mean, I don't think actually until you mention this, without thinking about the revolution in communications, particularly in the Arab world, the what Al Jazeera did for changing public discourse because of satellite broadcasting, and really being able to beam into people's living rooms in that way, different messages, different narratives that would contradict the narrative of the various states. And it goes from maybe from fax machines that were this new and modern method of communication after cassettes that clerics might have used, but this may have been putting different types of clerics, different voices in that way. And we could go on about this, but that is in a sense partly the link in the first wave from telecommunications to where we are moving today. And in terms of space, what had interested me, and in particular, was looking at what's happening and how quickly and how everything kind of connects with space, but also how you see this, I will say, renaissance or interest that we saw evolving in the last 10 to 15 years by many countries, and particularly Gulf countries with a lot of money, and investing in their programs, writing national strategies for space, connecting it. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, to national development plans. And of course, the security element that's always there, which has been what drives a lot of people's interest in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah. So just to also place you in the world here on Earth, your students call you Dr. Rubin.
They do, when on a good day, maybe professor sometimes. Yeah. Yes, professor also.
And wasn't Professor Dr. Rubin at a certain Middle East space conference recently? And you were telling me before we started recording some interesting flavorful bits about being at that particular conference. I mean, my understanding, this conference was in Oman. I think it was in Muscat. And it was well attended. Nova Space was also heavily involved, I believe, in organizing it. And yet there was a competing conference across the water in Saudi
right
Arabia. So what's going on with that?
Right. Well, a number of things. I would have loved to have gone to both. Some people did. And kind of to backtrack a little bit, I was really excited to attend this, in part because I don't get enough of an opportunity, I'd say, with really hearing what the conversations are in and among Middle East space actors, with those interested from the commercial sector, governments. And this gives me an opportunity to do my listening, hearing, research in a certain sense, and get a flavor for what's going on. And unfortunately, even though there are a lot, there are two at the same time. The Saudis have a space debris conference. And I always find it interesting because it plays into the politics. My first thought is, oh, was this intentional or unintentional? And just as a completely unscientific survey, I just asked a few people and got kind of a mixed response of, no, had nothing to do with this really had nothing. One person said, no, it did. It did. Anyway,
and the rumor mill just started to turn,
yes,
right?
I hope I didn't contribute to it at all. But it was really, I was just really curious about this and about other aspects of it. And there are a number of other space events that take place. I went to one last year in Morocco, for example, another Middle East space conference. It was much more focused on Africa and attracting interest there. But these are really interesting places to be for so many reasons. Not just who shows up there, but also the types of conversations that occur both on the panels, the topics that are discussed, but really off of that. And I really enjoy it from some of the conversations with what sometimes young people are doing, how they're thinking about space in the future. It might be young space entrepreneurs hoping to develop their own space ecosystems in that country. And I think it gives you a touch or flavor for where things may be going. And of course, they're taking and trying to look to leadership to say, okay, where is our country going to set up a clear set of regulations so that we can attract more commercial interest to the country and so forth. Itself, Oman was really interesting in that, first of all, I had never been. I'd spent a lot of time in the Middle East, but I'd never been there. But what was really interesting was, of course, they're promoting themselves, and what they want to try to do is this, of having a space port and attract commercial interest there. They also want to kind of be a player in this way, and this is a way to do it. What I think you can see as a broader strategy, and this connects to a lot of these programs, is that what are the purpose and motivation of investing in something that may not be that profitable or highly risky. And I know that there are, of course, the space enthusiasts, the ones say, "Oh, this is such a great investment. This is an incredible investment. Let's do it." And if you look at every single brochure that comes out from a consulting company, it'll be like, "This is the greatest place for you to invest because look at all this growth." And of course, they're going to say this. And this type of conference is really to say, "Here's we're on the map. Here's what we're doing, and we can convene." And I think a lot of countries want to try to do this to show themselves. But again, the end goal is in terms of economic diversification for a lot of these countries that are seeing their depleting resources from energy running out a lot faster than they want, clearly, and they need to find ways to invest in other things, and space may be one of them.
Well, seeing that you've kind of jumped ahead and where I want to start, and that's okay because I'll go back to some of the other things that I want to get to. But let's focus on some of these goals, strategic here, because we don't really pay enough attention to the Middle East or even know which nations there are even spacefaring states or which are space ambitious. I mean, Oman is space ambitious. It has a spaceport, but things really haven't launched from there yet. But I think viewers still realize the amount of political and capital investment that is being spent on developing sovereign space systems. And as you said, there's a lot of glossy brochures out there, but there is also some money being put to things, right? There's Space City, I believe, in Dubai, or at least that's what they're billing it as. So there's a lot that's going on. But why are they doing this? I mean, is it to participate in the space economy? Is it to further their diplomatic goals, like the memorandum of understanding between the Emiratis and the Egyptians? Is this about security? What are their strategic goals? Are they similar across the various states that are doing this? And what's driving them? Is it because that they think that the oil's going to run out or people are going to shift into electric cars or something? Or, what's driving this?
Right. Well, this is a great question. And this is actually kind of way I came into this, was asking these questions of saying, what are the motivations and trajectories of some of these programs? And can you put them in various categories? I think you've highlighted a lot of them. Some might be the one is the security imperative, security and we'll say military and intelligence. And you can look at a couple programs like the origins were for the Israelis and the Iranians that way and how they developed. Others might be both, combinations of a number of different factors. Prestige, status is often cited this way. Economic diversification of making these investments. And again, they kind of are stronger, and some of those categories are stronger than some states than others, depending on what state we're talking about. And they're not always clear boundaries, because obviously, if you develop a robust space program, and you may have set out to do it for one reason, it's going to provide some type of prestige. There are certain programs that may be purely about status or prestige, but can sometimes serve other purposes. Let's say, for instance, sending somebody, space exploration is kind of a costly endeavor. It's a lot of investment in there. But the kind of the logic of the argument, and this is what the Emiratis, the Saudis, and so forth have made, is that this will inspire a knowledge-based economy. This will, in a sense, inspire youth to go into these STEM fields, which we have to have for the future. And I think that makes sense. And if you see the efforts, even at the cultural level, and the Emiratis have done this really well by, creating almost I won't say cult in a negative sense, but in a positive sense around astronauts, of saying this is really a public figure and an inspiration for our youth to do this. To go into some of these fields, and can't you do it too? Just the same way that you saw what NASA did and does for people around the world, and there's nothing like it. And so going kind of back to that, maybe in some cases a secondary motivation, in some cases, in some ways it may be a primary. And then there's some clear cases where, for instance, the origins of the Israeli program and its emphasis on intelligence, on ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, clearly comes from that, and the way that they're positioned in terms of their development of expertise in small satellites and all the technological know-how, primarily from the military sector. But of course, they've also got a very, very, I will say, active commercial sector that's trying to spin off from this. So you see kind of a mixture in various areas, and then there's also this element that of my neighbors doing it in some cases, and therefore maybe I need to jump into this game too.
Well, let's stick on Israel for a moment here because this week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with President Donald Trump at the White House. They discussed Iran, specifically the negotiations over Iran's long term ambition to develop nuclear weapons and its short term efforts to restart its uranium enrichment programs. Iran has stated that it has temporarily ceased uranium enrichment, but officials there continue to refuse access to the United Nations nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA. So the only overt way to monitor Iran's nuclear related activities is from the air or more likely from space through remote sensing. So with this meeting between Netanyahu and Trump, it'd be fair to say that the White House is focused on the Middle East this week, which is why I'd like to know from your perspective, what are the most consequential recent developments in space in the Middle East that you think that we should bear in mind for the rest of our discussion?
Well, great and timely question in that sense. And there are so many. And I think it really kind of, one of the things I want to jump back to, I think a lot of people missed in that way or maybe overlooked, is if you look at the 12-day Iran-Israel war, this was a war above the skies in a certain sense. This is all directed, as we talked about, everything comes to space. Without getting into this, it was about spoofing. It was about obviously targeting, interceptions, and almost people take it for granted that this happens, but it's because of the assets in space. Of course, on the ground assets matter that much more, both from Israel's allies in the region and these coordination efforts that are taking place. But these coordination efforts are all above us. And I think that's, as all of these assets develop that much more, and as we heard in very recent announcements of saying, we've got this X or Y technology, this advanced technology, you don't know what that technology is until it kind of is used in practice. You have these nuclear talks. It's entirely clear, and it's entirely true. The worst case scenario for the West, in that sense of seeing Iran as a threat, is that you can marry any types of early warning targeting systems with nuclear capability. That would be the ultimate one, to put it on par or power, because it has a developing still, and this is what's been on the agenda for the Israelis and others, Iran's ballistic missile program, which, of course, if it's as we talk about dual use in that sense, both can be launching satellites and also launching, against land-based targets.
Well, that goes right along with the recent announcement, right, that the head of Iran Space Agency, Hassan Salarieh, he confirmed that his agency intends to launch the first satellite for its communications constellation. That planned constellation is called the Martyr Soleimani, which, if we remember, that happens to be the person that U.S. forces took out and that's a diplomatic way of putting it. But I have to admit here that I find this launch a little bit incredible because of the timing, because if the timing is at the very same time that these talks that are happening over its nuclear program, right? And it will demonstrate launch capability, which can be used, as you said, for missiles. The other thing that I find confusing to me is that this is a communications satellite program. But is having this kind of a program, doing these kinds of launches, is this even feasible after all the events that have cost the nation so much in blood and treasure? And there's also crushing sanctions. Can they really pull this off, or is this also a prestige thing to pull together the nation into some form of unity?
I think more towards the latter. When it comes to resources, it seems presumably if and however far they are along this process, they've already been invested. But the Iranians are also being pushed at the negotiating table to give up a lot of things that are close to infractions and, we'll say, intrusions on their sovereignty. If it's about how much can they enrich and so forth. And so this is a way of communicating, saying, by the way, we can do what we want. We are, whether or not they will end up launching is a different question, because also failure would probably be among the worst things beyond just being saying, why are you, the West, particularly the United States, saying, why are you doing this right now? You're just basically
Stirring the pot.
stirring the pot, confirming our suspicions. And secondly, you failed and you suck, that type of thing. So, and the
their
domestic
launches
public
have
would see it.
failed in the past
Yeah.
too. So there is a lot to say about sucking.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And so it could be one of saying, like, and by the way, and it is quite remarkable that they are one of two countries that have indigenous launch capabilities. And what is the ideal gold standard in a sense from a space program is you can do everything yourself, the manufacturing, the launch. And so this is really significant in that way of saying it. But of course, it's risky, of course, and maybe they anticipate the public kind of forgetting, or they say, you know what, we're going to hold off for a little while because we're in negotiations, which could be the face-saving measure. But it's a great way for them to go on press. If you watch, on television, they're saying, oh, we've unveiled this system. We're talking about doing this next month. But they could say, you know what, with respect to the current negotiations that are going on, we're going to wait on this, and that might be the way that they kind of step them back down a little bit.
And to be fair in doling out attention, the other spacefaring nation, that's Israel. There have been a few pieces of space news worth mentioning. Because earlier this month, Avi Berger, head of the space office at the Defense Ministry's Directorate of Defense Research and Development, told the Jerusalem Post that the ministry was working on, quote, surprises. That's kind of interesting. There were no data points really in that exchange, but just to say that makes you kind of go, that's different. But it was also announced that a new space innovation center is being called Space City, like other space cities, but it's going to be built in a place called Mispe Ramon. And if I said that incorrectly, please forgive me, everyone. But this space city is supposed to be a place where entrepreneurs can receive all kinds of support for developing space technologies and businesses. And I think it's really helpful for the audience to know that in 2024, the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, it established a space directorate unit. Israel has been a spacefaring nation for a really long time, which is why it has sovereign space launch capabilities. So here's an interesting question for you. Does Israel see the space domain as a new front to monitor and, if necessary, act? Because Israeli officials like to say that Israel is fighting on 7 fronts. Is space becoming the 8th front?
Well, I don't think it's a new front in that sense, because they've been there for a while. It may be that
Well, we've been there for a while, but it was like a gentleman's game, right? Don't shoot at my stuff, I won't shoot at yours, and we'll get along just fine. But we are talking about the possibility of nations putting nuclear weapons in space and targeting each other, and there's lasing and dazzling, and so it's getting a bit hotter up there.
Right. Certainly, the anti-satellite capabilities have increased, and potentially to threaten some of these, we'll say, advantages that Israel might have from the sky, from seeing this, especially with developments in the Iranian program, and even among some friends and allies, just putting more things up there might be, there might be great cooperation on the military front between the Emiratis and the Israelis. That's fairly quiet in space. And in probably a number of other nations, but the barriers to entry have lowered, and particularly in some aspects of anti-satellite warfare. So these are probably some of the areas. And the other aspect is really thinking about, I think that what you brought up with regard to this kind of space city at Mitzpe Ramon, which I think have been in talks. There've been talks about it for a while. It's just another development among what a lot of these countries have done in trying to generate jobs. Some are kind of off of the more populated areas into development area to develop these different communities there. And it's pretty far from a lot of certainly the population centers in Tel Aviv, and the closest one is to that, the biggest city is Beersheba. But
That's still not that far away, though.
No, I mean not compared to other places purely, but in terms of the environment, it's a lot of the physical environment. The reason why it's there, it's in a big basically, Mitzpe Ramon is a huge crater in the central or kind of the central part of the desert, the Negev. But in other places, the similar types of things exist. This is what a lot of these countries have tried to establish, of saying, here are going to have some big feature and create a space ecosystem around this. And it has, in a lot of ways, it's also physical because of the proximity that they want companies to be close to each other. They want people to be close to each other. It's kind of the startup mentality there. The Egyptians have this sort of, space city that they have are developing and established. Their space agency is right down the street, almost in a parking lot from the African Space Agency. They anticipate just bringing in businesses this way, or they want this. The same type of thing with, again, going back to Oman, that this space port, although it's 7 or 8 hours from, I think it's about a 7 or 8 hour drive from Muscat, which you would expect to be most of where that a lot of the kind of the businesses might be and the people might be. I think they want to create other, develop it for maybe space tourism one day in a certain sense, or even it's a nice place along the water to see. Those are kind of the things that I think that a lot of these states want to do to try to develop and expand their, as I said, space economy, space ecosystems in that way. And it's not just even within space, because I think that's what they're trying to make this argument for, is that it connects with so many other technologies that we have that are advancing. I mean, you can't get away from some of them, computing power, anything to do with AI and so forth.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned AI, because NVIDIA also is somewhat invested in this space city in Israel. At least that's what the press release said. We are running out of time, but I have to ask you this question, and it's kind of an unfair question, but that's kind of how it is here on the podcast, right? But just hear me out. Right. Most everyone in the audience or coming on this podcast is acutely aware of the US-China competition in the space domain, and to a lesser degree, competition with Russia. And we are aware that this competition starts on the ground. China's big strategic initiatives that involve space come in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Space Silk Road, the International Lunar Research Center, which we also like to call the ILRS, because actually it's a center station. And then the Tiangong space station. This week, China reportedly cleared 2 Pakistan nationals to become taikonauts. Right. The U.S. has its own mechanisms, such as the Artemis Accords, the International Space Station, and military-to-military operational relationships with combatant commands, definitely with Space Command and the Space Force, such as the Space Force Space Campus on Al Adid Air Base in Qatar. There really are too many efforts to look into for the time that we have. So what I really want to ask you is about the opportunities. And I want to know, if somebody important is listening to this podcast and needed a new idea or inspiration, what is the one opportunity that you think the U.S. needs to work on in the region? If you were tasked to draft a priorities list, what would be at the top and why?
Well, I'm glad we got to this at the end, because it ties into so many different things. Number one is I buried the lead on the Oman conference, and that is that the fact that Oman became a signatory of the Artemis Accords while I was there, and for me, it was a special thing to see. That's first and foremost, and that really ties into a lot of their efforts, and almost in a sense, and encouraging them. But people do know, or may or may not know about Oman and how it's positioned in the region, that it tends to have, we'll say, good relations with many different parties. If it's the United States and China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, in that way, or we'll say neutral relations. Sometimes it may not be that good, but sometimes it's not really bad. And this is what it prides itself on. So it may have looked in this camp, but at the same time, it has a company that also signed on to what might be, I won't say in opposition to the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, but at the same time signed on to, as a country, the Artemis Accords. And what I'll tell you now to kind of get to the answer of the question that you asked was, what can we do with one more quick thing? Among these stories, among some of these conferences that I've attended when I go in the region, I look for a few things, and it's one of them's kind of interesting. Where are the Chinese presence on this? What is the United States doing in these ways? And I'm just kind of curious about this and how are they engaged in interacting. One thing I found with talking to space professionals in the region, and is kind of we'll say a complaint. I won't put it that way because they wouldn't put it that way. What they would want more from the United States is more engagement, more investment, and kind of less constraints when it comes to cooperation. And we hear this from in many different sectors. If it's about, well, even something like arms, military tech, other types of technologies of the United States has all these restrictions, and why can't we do something like they understand, like the Chinese, where it's much easier to engage. So some of them could
that's
be
because they are engaging with the Chinese.
well, yeah,
I mean, right? I mean, because like if they weren't, it might be easier to share.
Well, I think it's more of sometimes it's just transferring technology. Sometimes it's a chicken or egg problem in certain ways. But I think a few areas there may be low hanging fruit in that way. If climate isn't such a bad word, climate security partnerships might be one, because a lot of these countries in the Middle East are really worried about what happens to their countries in the increasing temperatures, however you want to put it, that we see across the world, but particularly in some of these countries, and unbearable ones there. And maybe there's something like this. A lot of them are very interested, obviously, in imagery of having to do with weather, agriculture, and maybe about other, water
Security.
water security in those ways. So any types of cooperation on Earth observation, those types of things, partnership programs, education, these are huge things. But what I keep hearing time and time again is really working to help build capacity among some of these emerging space sectors, meaning working on projects together in some way. And in some cases, and we don't have time for this by any means, some teams with wealthier countries would be able to embed and learn from some more advanced spacefaring nations and learn how to work and build satellites together, and then go back to their country and train and become, the trainers of the trainers and so forth. So this is one way. Another way to do it, and just to be there or to be present, I think, is another one. That really makes a big difference, I think, for a lot of these countries. And to say they're going to be, and there have been efforts at this. It's not saying this isn't entirely it, but they're sometimes stuck in our bureaucracy, for better or for worse. And it's much easier if you want to see it, and I don't always see it in direct competition, but the Chinese, sometimes it's easier for them to cut through the red tape and just to do things. And so those are kind of a couple of quick recommendations. They're almost low hanging fruit in that way. They may not be, actually, given our bureaucracy, but increased engagement in lots of different ways, and working on finding ways to do joint ventures together, beyond, or support to universities to do this. This is what they're calling for. A lot of these education. I hear that as being in higher education, of saying how can we get our universities to cooperate? And we have great diplomats in the region ready to help facilitate this, but kind of not always things in place to do this. And that could be another way to do this. So if anybody's listening and has money or funds in that way to help facilitate some of this cooperation, then this is the call to you. So put this in your budgets.
Larry, thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I hope your listeners do too.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.